Welcome to the Elizabeth Seton Lectures. The Religious Studies Department of Mount St. Vincent University, with the sponsorship of the Sisters of Charity, is pleased to offer the 15th annual Elizabeth Seton Lecture Series. And to bring this time to the Mount, an outstanding expert of biblical scholarship on interpreting the scriptures in the 90s. Dr. Walter Vogels is currently professor of biblical studies at St. Paul's University in Ottawa. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to continue our custom of recalling at the opening session the origin and purpose of the Elizabeth Seton Lecture Series. I would ask Sister Maria Sutherland, Superior of the Halifax Province of the Sisters of Charity, to do this for us. Sister Maria.
So on behalf of the Sisters of Charity, I also bid you good evening and welcome to the Elizabeth Seton Lectures. 15 years ago, when we established this lecture series, the theme was determined to be Christian presence in the world, past, present, and future. We wanted to make an ongoing contribution towards strengthening at Mount St. Vincent an atmosphere rooted in Christian tradition and characterized by truth, intellectual vigor, and social responsibility. These are words the Mount uses to describe the environment it is committed to maintain. Now, many of you have been attending these lectures since their foundation, and the story of Elizabeth Seton, whose name they bear, is very familiar to you. Whenever I have prepared an introduction to the lectures, I have been struck by the ease with which I could relate each topic to some aspect of her remarkable life. Last year, we heard about healthcare choices and recalled how well acquainted Mother Seton was with illness and death, having suffered the loss of her husband, 2 of her children, several young sisters in her community, and many of her friends before her death at the age of 46. The year before, as we reflected on the Canadian experience, we learned how Elizabeth had wanted to establish her community in Canada, and how similar our times are to her own in their doubt and division and discouragement. A year earlier, our topic was contemporary moral issues, and we discovered the centrality of love in Elizabeth's life as the basis of her moral choices, and the depth of her belief that doing God's will would lead her to greater love. So tonight we begin a series of lectures on sacred scripture. And again, it was easy to connect Elizabeth Seton with this topic. Love of the Word of God was an earmark of Mother Seton's spirituality, and she often spoke of it as her dear scriptures. As a child, after her mother died, Elizabeth went to live with relatives in the country. She was often lonely there and turned to God for companionship. And this was the beginning of a lifelong devotion to reading the Bible. Few Catholics of those days would have had this opportunity, but Elizabeth was the granddaughter of an Episcopalian rector and a member of that church until after her husband's death. Throughout her life, Bible reading was a principal source of Elizabeth's comfort. On one occasion, she wrote, "The sun was bright, and I was seated in the open air, and I read my Bible for 2 hours." On another, "I have just passed one of the most pleasant evenings of my life. It is now 11 o'clock, and I have been sitting here since 7 with my book. which has spoken to me of the Most High and the Most Holy. I have selected here and there and copied passages which I like to preserve for my daughter. And in the detention center in Italy, where Elizabeth was quarantined with her dying husband, she relied on her devotion to scriptures to sustain her and wrote to a friend, "Today I read him several passages from Isaiah, which he enjoyed so much that he was carried for a while out of his troubles. Indeed, our reading is an unfailing comfort." No doubt, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, the lonely child, the sorrowing wife and widow, the devoted parent, the inspiring teacher, whose love of Scripture was so integral to her spiritual life, is anxious to hear what Father Vogels has to say tonight, just as we are. But before I end, I must once again extend a word of grateful appreciation to the Religious Studies Department of the Mount, who so capably carry on the planning and direction of this annual lecture series.
Thank you, Sister Maria. It is now my privilege to introduce tonight's topic and speaker. Our topic tonight is interpreting the scriptures in the 90s, the intention of the author. Interpreting the scriptures demands a most extraordinary discipline of human thought, one that is penetrating without being impenetrable, humanly sensitive without being morally compromising, historically realistic without falling into historicism, instructed by other disciplines without being controlled by them, informed by tradition without being enslaved by it. Interpreting the scriptures, therefore, is a severe testing ground for the human mind and spirit. Fortunately, Dr. Walter Vogels has proven himself to be of such a mind and spirit. Born in Anvers, Belgium, Walter Vogels is a member of the Society of African Missionaries, White Fathers. He is professor of Old Testament at St. Paul's University and was Vice Dean of the Faculty of Theology from 1976 to 1982. Dr. Vogels is a frequent guest lecturer and professor at universities and institutes in Canada, United States, Europe, Africa, Israel, Australia, and Asia. Dr. Vogels' articles in scientific and pastoral journals number more than 100. His writings have been published in English, French, Dutch, and German. He has made contributions to several collective works and dictionaries. The most recent of his 12 books are Becoming Fully Human, A Biblical Perspective, Vivre selon la Bible in 1989, Job, a commentary, and Les Prophètes. Professor Vogels serves as consultant for Journey, a study guide for the Old and New Testaments, and for its French edition, Montée, for the catechetical program of the Canadian Catholic Conference of Bishops, and their revision of the Bible readings in the liturgy, and for the International Commission on English in the Liturgy. He is editorial consultant for Église et Théologie. He is an active member of the Association catholique des études bibliques au Canada and served as its vice president from 1980 to 1983. He is a member of the Catholic Biblical Association of America, of the Société catholique de la Bible, and of the Society of Biblical Literature. Ladies and gentlemen, I now invite Dr. Walter Vogels to speak to us of interpreting the scriptures in the 90s, the intention of the author.
Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank the department and the sisters for inviting me here. When I got that letter of invitation and the phone call, I really must say that I was very honored to come to this place and to share with you some of the insights that I have on the scriptures. And it was said that the topic of those lectures are going to be on how to interpret the scriptures in the 90s. And since we are so close to the second millennium, we could say, how is it going to be in the second millennium? How are we going to read the scriptures in the second millennium? And all of you who are familiar with biblical studies, you know that we are in a very exciting period. Very exciting. This last century has been, and especially I speak for the Catholic tradition, the century where the Bible became now a book that was open, that was given to the people. And it was also the century that biblical studies were accepted as critical studies. And now, once this was accepted, you know what happened? People start questioning all those studies. And so we have to start all over again. And so what I would like to do is, tonight I'm going to look at one aspect, and more precisely to the aspect that has been studied the last century. Obviously, when we speak about the Bible, there is one person who is obviously the first one we think of. Someone wrote that text here. And this is the person, or the persons, that we have favored. We have favored to look at the writer or the writers. But we start seeing that besides the writers and the writer, there is the text itself. And then thirdly, there is we, the readers. And each of those three, they bring their own world. The writer who wrote this book lived in his or her world. That book as a world in itself, and we as readers, we bring to the Bible our own world. So for those who have looked at the program, tomorrow I'm going to speak in the second lecture on the reader, and in the third lecture on the text itself. So tonight we are going to look at the intention of the writers. And for the three lectures, I will proceed in the same way. I will proceed first by saying, this is a theory. What happens to a text if we favor the writer, or if we favor the text, or if we favor the reader? What is the theory? And in order not to remain in the skies, I suggest and I propose that in the second aspect of each lecture, we are going to apply then the theory upon a text. And the text that I have chosen is a text that we all know. The story of the apple. The story of Adam and Eve. A story we all know. At least we think we all know the story. And then in a third aspect of each lecture, I will reflect on the limits and also the advantages of each of those three ways of looking at the text. So tonight, we are going to look at the intention of the writer. or the writers. And so first let us look now at the presuppositions and the theory of that approach to the text. The most obvious thing, of course, that we can say about the text is that someone wrote it. There would be no book without a writer. And we suspect that that writer intended to write a text that has meaning. In other words, that that person wanted to communicate something. So therefore, it appears that it is the right question to ask ourselves, what did the writer have in mind? In other words, what is the intention of the writer? And all of us who have followed courses in exegesis or have given courses in exegesis, you all have raised that question, or you have had that question asked to you after you have given a course on the scriptures. People say to you, do you really think Luke was thinking on all that? In other words, we feel that interpreting the scriptures must be what the writer had in mind. And if you happen to be a writer, and if you have ever written something, if you have written a book, I suppose that you all wanted that the people who read that book understand what you want to say. And this has happened to people who write books, and it has happened to me too, that you read a book report on your book. And after you read that book review, you say to yourself, why did that person not read what I was writing? The importance of the writer is also very clear, because this quite often determines the reason why people buy books. Did you ever notice that? I am convinced that if Michener writes a new novel, he will sell a few more millions. Why? Because people like the style or like the books of Michener. So whatever, we don't even know what's in the book, but we are going to buy the book. And if Schillebeeckx writes another book on theology, he's going to sell a few thousand too. Could you imagine that archaeologists would discover an old document in Israel? Can you imagine how people would run to that document? But could you imagine if the archaeologist would say and could prove that that text was written by Paul? Could you imagine the importance suddenly? Because Paul wrote that. So that the writer is important, I think we all know that. And when I read now a letter that I received from my best friend, I certainly will try to find out what she wanted to tell me. And because we are very close to each other, and because most of the time letters that people write to each other are not difficult, I think it's going to be rather easy to understand. But even then, did you ever notice how many misunderstandings there are? And I have given you a situation which is the easiest. I spoke about two friends. Because communication by letter or by writing is determined by two elements. Who wrote that text? And what and how did that person write? And I would like that we reflect a moment on those two elements. Who wrote that text? Do you see that a lot is going to depend on the degree to which the writer and the reader, writer and reader, share a common world of discourse and experience? And of course, this degree is easy when it comes to two friends. But if you speak now about two people who live or who lived in different cultural contexts, do you start seeing the complexities? Do you start seeing how difficult it is going to be when people have not the same language, don't speak the same language, or lived centuries apart? And the second difficulty is the degree to which the text involves specialized content and form. When you speak about letters between friends, this is rather easy. But did you ever try to understand a letter written by a lawyer? Why? Because those people use forms and technical vocabulary which is not the daily language that we use. Now, everybody realizes that the Bible is certainly not in the optimal conditions for communicating. Why? Because first of all, there is a tremendous distance between the writer and the reader. And secondly, the forms and the content of the Bible quite often uses language that's not familiar to us. If you ever have tried to read some of the letters of Paul, you realize what I'm saying here. Not to speak about the book of the Revelation of John, the Apocalypse. So obviously you all realize that the author-centered interpretation, in other words, when we read the scriptures and we ask ourselves, what did the writer have in mind, that we have a very important task, but at the same time a very difficult one. And so it is not only the writer that we try to understand, but we realize that that writer was living in a cultural, an ideological, an historical, a linguistic, a social and political conditions which are very different from ours. And this is what Vatican II said. And I quote now a text that came out from the documents of Vatican II. As I indicated in the beginning of the lecture, it is in this century that for Catholics at least, the interpretation of the scriptures was accepted in a critical way. And this is what Vatican II says. The interpreter must investigate what meaning the sacred writer intended to express and actually expressed in particular circumstances as he used contemporary literary forms in accordance with the situation of his own time and culture. Did you hear that? If I want to understand the scriptures, I have to figure out the context in which that writer was writing, and that writer used forms, that writer was writing in a way which is different from ours. And I would like to illustrate that now with a few examples taken from profane literature. With two examples. I suppose that we are all familiar with Dante. And Dante wrote a Divine Comedy. Now, in that text, he speaks about a few cardinals. And I suppose that any person who reads those texts can understand what he says about those cardinals. But the story becomes much more exciting if we know that the cardinals to whom he was referring were not purely in his imagination, but that he was referring to historical persons. I give another example. This is the example of a book written by Marcel Proust, À la recherche du temps perdu. So this was a French writer, a very famous book that he started in 1909. And he wrote it, and then he corrected and he changed it until he finished in 1922 when he died, and he stopped changing. Now, everybody can read that book by Marcel Proust. And even he says himself that everybody can understand that book. And you can enjoy it. And when you read a book, you will see that the I, when the writer says, I, this and this, That refers to the narrator. And the narrator speaks about his love for a young woman, Albertine Simonet. Now, people who have read the biography of Marcel Proust, know that the I of the narrator is not a narrator, but is Proust himself. And we'll know that Proust was a homosexual, so that Albertine was not Albertine, but was Albert. So obviously, the understanding of the book is going to be different. And I would like now that we look for a few moments in some of the different aspects that are going to be important, that we take into account when we are looking at the intention of the writer. I'm going to enumerate a few and illustrate it by a few examples taken from that text, and I suppose that you all have received a copy of this here. Taken from the text of the apple. Huh? The first aspect, or one aspect that's related to the writer is that the writer always lives somewhere. A writer always lives somewhere. I was introduced here, so you know a few things about me. But if I had not been introduced to you, after 2 words you have said yourself, where does he come from? And this is the question that I have heard so often now. And most of the time people are very kind. They say, where are you from? I like your accent. You know what that means, huh? And so that happens to me once, that a person said, where are you from? And I say to myself, I'm not going to say that I'm from Antwerp, because probably the person is not going to know that. But I'm going to tell the person that I'm from Belgium. And you know what the person said to me? Is that in South America? May I ask you, can you feel a little bit how I felt then? But it has happened quite often, that people said, where are you from? I said, I'm from Antwerp. Oh, yeah, from Antwerp, from Belgium, I was there. Do you see immediately a different relationship? Totally different. I met once a person, he said, oh, I was there with the military. I say, where were you? I said, I'm a little village. I said, tell me. So the person said, I was in Hoven. Now that happens to be very close to where I live. Now can you see immediately what type of connection we had? Because we knew what? We had something in common, we had a place in common. Now I suppose that many here, or at least a few of here, had the opportunity of visiting the Holy Land, to go to Israel. Now I suppose that you all will agree with me that when you read the Gospel and you have seen the Lake of Galilee and you have seen Jerusalem, that your text is going to speak in a different way. Why? Because now we know the geographical context of the writer. And so if you read now the story of paradise, do you see that they speak about a garden in Eden? And I don't know if anyone here has been in Eden. So if anyone has been there, please see me after the conference. But perhaps at least some of you have seen the Tigris or the Euphrates. And of course, this is the streams that they are talking about. So probably that text is going to speak a bit differently. And if you have been in Israel, you all know what it means to have water. Because in that paradise, says the text, there were 4 streams, 4 rivers. A lot of water. One element. When we read the text, when we know the geographical context of the writer, this is going to help me to understand the text. But there is more. There is something else. A writer always lives in a particular period in history. If we have to understand what is going on in Canada now, about all the constitutional problems, what do we have to know? We have to know something about the history. And so obviously, it's going to be important for us to figure out the person who wrote that text here, when was that person living? And a bit later in my conference I will say to you that some people pretend that the writer was at the time of Solomon. Now, you know that the time of Solomon was the time of prosperity. That was the only period in the history of Israel that Israel was an empire. So obviously you write to people in a different way when you are in prosperity and luxury as compared to the person who wrote the first chapter of Genesis, who was living in the exile. A writer lives somewhere. A writer lives at a certain period in time, and a writer also, of course, has his or her particular culture. A couple of years ago, I was teaching at the university, and I had a student from Sri Lanka. And I had explained something to my student. And I asked if the student had understood me, and the person said, so I thought that he said that he did not understand me. So I repeated everything, and I said to him, do you understand me? It's only later that I realized that the people in Sri Lanka, when they say yes, or when we say yes, they say yes. This is culture. Now, in our story here, in chapter 3, verse 1, they speak about a serpent. They speak about a serpent. Now, I don't know in our culture what a serpent means. But I suppose that we all have some type of feelings about serpents. Now, how did the writer feel about a serpent? That's my question. Not how we feel about serpents, but how does the writer feel about serpents? What does a serpent mean for the writer? That's my question, if I want to find out the intention of the writer. Now, archaeologists, they have discovered in Israel a lot of statues, little statues. And on the statues we see a woman, and around the woman, on her breast, is a serpent. And we know now that this was statues from the cult of fertility. So obviously, do you see that for the writer, when they spoke about a serpent, this was not the same thing as for us, even if we also keep still the serpent for medicine, the symbol of medicine. Another aspect which is important, of course, is the social and the political context in which the writer was living. And if I look now at chapter 3, verse 16, to the woman he said, I will multiply, etc. Your yearning shall be for your husband, yet he will lord it over you. Now we all know that women have been oppressed, but again, what does that mean for that writer in that time? If you travel a little bit in the world, you see that women are treated in different ways in different parts of the world. What did that mean for the writer then? And finally, and this is perhaps the most important and the most difficult, the person had also, the writer had his or her linguistic context. So in other words, the person is writing in a particular language. And it just so happened that the original language of the Bible was not English, but was Hebrew, at least for the Old or the Hebrew Bible, and Greek for the New Testament. Now, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, I will make you enemies of each other, you and the woman, your offspring and her offspring. And in the translation that you have received, the text says, it will crush your head. Now, if some of you would look in other Bibles, you will see that other Bibles say he. And you say to yourself, but why can exegetes not translate the text like it should be? Why does one say he and the other say it? For a very simple reason. That in Hebrew, the word that's used there is who. Now, those of you who know French, in French you have il, et elle. Et il, if you translate it in English, you are going to translate it by what? By he or it. And so the same thing is there for Hebrew. You have who, and who in Hebrew can be translated by he or it. We will come back to that later, because this is going to affect the meaning of that text tremendously, according to the translation you opt for. The Bible is written in a particular language, so we have to know the language context of the writer. And of course, a writer uses words. Words. And you may think, you may believe that you understand words, but be careful, because words can have very different meanings. And I would like to illustrate that by a simple example taken from the English language. When we here in Canada speak about winter, you know what comes to my mind? Snow, ice, cold, warm clothes, maybe even short days, and maybe even an evening around the fireplace, and maybe eventually Christmas. One year I was invited to go to Australia, and I was going there in July and August. And a person says to me, be careful because that's winter there. It's winter there. So I started thinking, snow, boots, and I asked someone from Australia at university. They said, where are you going? I say, I'm going to Queensland. Oh, he said, there's going to be 25, 35 degrees. Up, huh? Plus. That's winter. So the same word, winter, does not seem to have the same meaning. So it becomes important that I know that the writer of that English text was Canadian or Australian. If I read in an English text the word gay, it's rather important that I know when that text was written. And so, if I read now in our story of Genesis, if I read in the story of Genesis, in chapter 2, verse 25, now both of them were naked, the man and his wife, but they felt no shame in front of each other. And of course, I read there naked. And if I read that now from the Canadian perspective, or if I read it like most people think about, or at least many people think about nakedness, because nakedness in our culture is so much connected with playboy, striptease, or whatever you could call it, do you see that immediately you are going to read that text in a sexual interpretation? While nakedness in biblical thinking is very different. Very different. Nakedness has something to do with our limits, with our, yes, what we are. We are naked. I am naked in front of you, which means you can see me like I am. That's what I am. And they were not ashamed for what they were. That's all. Now, if we say that we have to understand what the writer says, we have to know something of the language of that person, and a language means a particular characteristics. A language uses words, but now something happens when we put words in a sentence. Because it may well be that I understand all the words, but I have not a clue what the sentence means. There is a beautiful song that came out by Crystal Gale years ago. Don't you make my brown eyes blue. Did you ever think about that sentence? Don't you make my brown eyes blue. Brown is brown, but blue is not blue. you have to know the English language very well to understand that sentence. No, think about it. And so I go back to our text of the paradise now, and may ask you to take verse 24 of chapter 2. This is why a man leaves his father and mother and joins himself to his wife, and they become one body. How can that be? How can two people become one body? Don't you make my brown eyes blue. And of course, people who read nakedness in the sexual interpretation, do you see that immediately they are going to say this is a reference to intercourse? And I'm sorry. That text does not speak only about that. That text speaks about, as you can see, this is why a person leaves his father and mother and joins himself to his wife. This is now the transfer from a relationship of a child to his or her parents to becoming now the relationship between two adults. And they become one body, like we speak about the body of Christ, which hopefully, probably has not too many sexual connotations there. Now, let's imagine that we understand all the sentences now. Sentences are put together in literature, and whenever we read now a story, each story has its own literary genre. Which means what? Which means that each text has to be read in different ways, like the text is. You know, when I am serious in class, and the students think that I'm joking, they are in trouble. Okay? If I'm joking and they take me serious, that's their problem. Do you see what I'm saying? When you start reading a story, once upon a time, you all adjust to what is called the literary genre. Okay? You know that this is a fairy tale. And you know what? We all do that automatically. But when it comes to the Bible, I don't know, for many people then they lose all their decent and their natural principles of reading. I read in this text here, in chapter 3, the serpent was the most subtle of all the beasts that Yahweh God had made. I think that I can read that the serpent was an animal. That's what the text says. It asked the woman, now may I ask you, in what type of stories do animals speak? You all have the answer. But do you see when it comes to the reading of that text that people say, yes, but you know, that's the Bible. No, I'm sorry. That's the Bible, just precise, it's just like any other book. And if you look in the text and you find there that in the garden there was, in chapter 2, verse 9, they speak about the tree of life and the tree of knowledge and good and evil. I don't know if here in Halifax you have botanical gardens, maybe you have. We in Ottawa, we have the experimental farm, and they have all kinds of different trees. But as far as I know, I have never seen a tree of the knowledge and good and evil. So obviously, that text here is what? It's not an historical text. You see that? This is what is called fiction. Fiction. And now people say, so this is not true. I'm sorry. We will have the chance to speak about it later. Literature is not simply using words put in a sentence, sentences making them a literary form, but then all those little stories make out a book. Now, do you see that most of the time when we write books, this is very simple. You start writing chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and then you go to the printer and there it is. Now, sometimes books have a much more complex history. It may well be that the writer uses material that he or she has taken from somewhere else. That happens, Sometimes they quote it, sometimes they don't. What happens also is that the writer may give his or her manuscript to a person, and that person is going to edit the text, okay? Sometimes it also happens that people have found the manuscript of a person who died and is going to publish that. Do you start seeing that books can have different origins? It may happen also that there are several editions of a book. And consequently, when we read the Bible, we know that those books too have a very complex history, a very complex and a very long history. May I ask you to look now at your text that you have here in front of you. Since on that page you have a few verses that don't belong to the paradise story in the beginning, there, chapter 2, verse 1 to 4, we are lucky that it's also printed because you may notice something. You may notice something. Did you notice that all those preceding verses, there, chapter 2, verse 1 to 4, that each time the text refers to God, the text says God? You all notice that? God. And when you read chapter 2, verse 1, thus heaven and earth were completed. You hear that? Heaven and earth. And chapter 2, verse 4, such were the origins of heaven and earth. Do you hear it? Heaven and earth. And now let's start reading verse 5. Verse 5. At the time when Yahweh God made earth and heaven. Do you hear something different now? Suddenly, what do you notice? You notice that they don't say God, but they say Yahweh God. And they don't speak anymore about heaven and earth, but they speak about earth and heaven. And so for many other reasons that I'm not going to explain to you, many of you are familiar with that, I suppose, those two chapters, they are in the same book of Genesis. Do you start seeing that the book of Genesis must have a more complex origin? And consequently, that the question of what is the intention of the writer is going to become a bit more difficult. Because now we have at least two writers. And when I look now in that story of Genesis chapter 2, the paradise story, may I ask you to look at a few things. Because when I read that story, it looks like that text in itself is complex. You have chapter 2, verse 8. Yahweh God planted a garden in Eden, which is in the east, and there he put the man he had fashioned. So if I read the text correctly, is he there? Is that person there in that paradise? That's what the text says, no? He put them there. I read verse 15. Yahweh God took the man and settled him in the garden, where he was already. One other of those strange things in that story. If you read chapter 3, verse 7. Chapter 3, verse 7. So after they have eaten of the fruit, the text says, so they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. So they are clothed, They are no longer naked, right? That's what the text says. And I continue reading. And when God comes down and starts asking questions, in verse 10, I heard the sound of you in the garden, replies the human person there. I was afraid because I was naked. And I say, how can he say that he is naked? They were just clothed. And since they are naked, even if they were clothed, in chapter 3, verse 21, Yahweh God made clothes out of skins for the men, and they put them on. So over their fig leaves, or one for the week and one for the Sunday, or whatever. I just pointed to a few difficulties. And do you see that people say, hey, that writer here must be using different sources. And so this text is not simply written by one writer, but by several. And do you start seeing how more complex it becomes, the whole question of the intention of the writer? After I have shown what we should know about writers when we would like to find the intention of the writer, in other words, we have to know something about the context in which that person is writing, the historical context, the geographical context, the social, the political, the linguistic context. Do you see that until now, I have taken a few verses, but I would like now to apply the principles that I have said upon the text. So let us move now to the second part of our talk tonight, the application of it. Because until now, I never said who was the writer. Did you notice? Now, who is that writer? Since our time is moving fast, I'm going to be brief. There is a good chance that what I'm going to present to you tonight and tomorrow will be published, so you can read it more in detail later. But simply so that question, who is now that writer? And the answer was very simple, who the writer was. You know who it was? Moses. Moses was the writer. So people have said that Moses was the writer. And then, of course, if Moses was the writer, and Moses, of course, lives very close to the beginning of the world, because you know that there is an Irish bishop who has counted when the beginning of the world was. That was in the year 4004, October the 26th, at 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm serious, I'm serious. That was calculated. So Moses, of course, Moses knew everything. And so people, since Moses wrote it, they were reading that text historically. Okay? And then you know all the story that was connected with that. So the text is speaking about Adam and Eve, a couple that lived there in the beginning of the world. They were eating of a tree. And there was even an apple tree. Remember the apple? Even if the text never speaks about an apple, but anyhow, they had been eating of an apple. And because if they have been eating of an apple, we all are born with an original sin, that little spot here in our whatever, in our soul. And so, that was the interpretation of the text because Moses wrote it. Now, if you have followed what I tried to say to you, that the writer of Genesis chapter 1 cannot be the same as the writer of chapter 2, you remember why? Scholars now have said, who is now that writer? When did that person live? Where does he come from? And do you see that in a certain sense, this is easy to find? If you read a Canadian text, the history of Canada, do you see that you don't need much inspiration to figure out if the writer was French Canadian or English Canadian? So, reading through all those texts, people have discovered that the writer of the Paradise Story, chapter 2 and 3 here, must have been a person who lived around the time of Solomon. Okay? In Judah, in Jerusalem. And since we don't know the name of the person, they have given that person a name, and they have called him the Yahwist. And you guess why? Because he speaks about Yahweh God. So they have called him the Yahwist. Now, since we know that the Yahwist wrote it, because this now was the new gospel, after Moses got out of the picture, now the Yahwist appeared. This is now the new writer. And so, since the Yahwist was writing at the time of Solomon, people have said, and I'm following now what an American scholar has said, Walter Brueggemann, he said, okay, he said the Yahwist was writing, but when I read that story here, the story of Adam and Eve, in a certain sense, it looks like the Yahwist is writing what he sees happening, what he saw happening in Jerusalem. Do you remember David? And he makes a beautiful parallel. And since our time is going fast, I have no time to give all the details. But I'm going simply to point a few parallels, and you will see how appealing this is. Both, David and Adam and Eve, both are raised from nothing to something. If you remember in the book of Samuel, in second book of Samuel, chapter 7, the prophet Nathan says to David, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be the leader of my people Israel. So in other words, you were very, a shepherd, and now you become the king. And do you see that this is similar to Adam and Eve, who are taken from the dust to become now very important? There is very much similarities also between the responsibility they receive for a place. We see that in the text of the second book of Samuel, the text says, I took you to be the leader of my people Israel. And here God says to Adam and Eve, you are now in charge of that garden. Do you see the similarities? Both enjoy freedom, and at the same time there is a limit. In the text to David it is said that he will be now connected with God, but if he sins he will be punished. And of course you have the same thing here. The whole garden is to you, but except a tree. Do you start seeing the similarities? And it becomes even more striking, the similarities, if you notice how both David and Adam and Eve are attracted to one object which is forbidden. You remember the story of David? How David is attracted to the woman? And if you look at the text, David saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David made inquiries. David sent messengers and had her brought, and he slept with her. Did you hear that? He saw her, she was beautiful, etc. Now listen to the paradise story. The woman saw. You see the same thing? She sees the fruit. The woman saw that the tree was good and pleasing to the eye. You remember the woman was beautiful, now this tree is pleasing too? Do you see the similarities again? In both cases, they are conscious that they had done something wrong. You remember that David says, I have sinned against Yahweh. And you remember that they hide. They know that they did something wrong. In both cases, God judges them. God judges them. The text says that he deserves to die, David. But Yahweh, for his part, forgives your sin. You are not to die. And if you remember the story of paradise, there also, the day you eat of it, you will certainly die. And at the same time, they don't die. And finally, the similarity is even striking also, though the fact that after the sin of David and after the punishment, etc., there is still hope, because now a child is born. And the same thing happens after the story of the fall. The first thing that we see is Adam and Eve have a child. And so what Bruggeman concludes is that the Yahwist saw what has happened to David. And he says what has happened to David is basically our human condition. Okay? So Moses is no longer the writer, but it became the Yahwist. And now a new person comes along, or new persons come along. And I quote now Belgian scholar Vermeulen. And you remember that in that story there are a few irregularities? That they are clothed twice, and they are clothed and they still say that they are naked? You remember? And so he says that cannot be. That cannot be that the Yahwist is the writer of all that story. That cannot be. So he goes through the text, and I'm going to spare you all the technicalities, but he goes to the text, and he discovers in the text that that text of paradise cannot be attributed to one writer, but he says in that text there are 4 layers. 4 writers. And there is a first story, an old story. And in that old story there was not even a question of the woman. And there was not a serpent either. And now there is a second story. And that second story is the story of the Yahwist. You hear him, the Yahwist reappears. And the Yahwist in that story that describes how Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. But then later, a Deuteronomist, for those who are familiar with biblical studies, anyhow, another writer, has introduced to that story the fact that we are all punished for our own sin. And that's very clear in Genesis chapter 3. Huh? The woman is punished, the man is punished, each one for their own sin. And then finally, a few later additions. So he discovers 4. And by doing that, do you see that he demolishes completely the story, the explanation of Bruggeman? Because the fact that Adam and Eve are punished for their sin is no longer the story of the harvest, it's something added later. And if you think that the story becomes complicated, that's nothing yet. Because now, Moses is gone, the harvest is gone, or at least he's just kept for a few verses here and there. Now there is a person, a German scholar, Rentorf, and he says, but the harvest never existed. Was never any harvest. And there are others who say, the harvest, yes, but the harvest was not of the time of Solomon, but the harvest lived at the time of the exile. And now, of course, the whole thing collapses again. And I hope that you have seen what I try to show to you. That we are still looking for the author. And we were looking for what? We were looking for the intention of the author. And we don't know the author. And so now I come, as a conclusion of this first lecture, to the advantages and the limits of that type of biblical reading which we can call author-centered, when we think that reading the scriptures is trying to figure out the meaning intended by the writer. What I have described to you tonight is the approach which is taken by those of you who are familiar with biblical studies, what is called historical critical method, or I should say methods. Those methods try to discover the world behind the text. You understand what I'm saying? Here, that text here, someone, a whole world produced that text. We want to discover that world behind the text. And form criticism does that, and source criticism does that, and redaction criticism does that. But all the effort and all the research that we have put in it, we are still looking for the author. So how are we ever going to find out the intention of the writer? And I'm going even a step further. We were looking for the intention of the writer. And of course, when we say the intention of the writer, we mean what? We mean, what did the writer have in mind when that person wrote that text? Eh? But suddenly, since Sigmund Freud, we become aware that many things that we do are not simply consciously done, but also unconsciously. And so when we are looking for the intention of the author, now we know that that person who wrote that there are a lot of unconscious factors that have been playing. The feelings, the dispositions, the motives, the effects, the consequences, etc. And so there are now biblical studies, methods, that try to have an approach which can be called psychological or psychoanalytical methods, who try to discover not only the conscious but also the unconscious intention of the writer, whom we don't know. Now, even if one day we would arrive at determining with precision that's the writer, we have. Okay, let's imagine that one day we now arrive to say, now, that's the writer. Who can ever dream of really discovering what a writer had in mind? I don't know how you are, but I have difficulties understanding myself sometimes. And I have difficulties understanding people with whom I live 24 hours a day. Okay? So how am I ever going to understand the intention of a writer, even if I now wouldn't have the name? Do you see, the only person who could answer that, you know what that is? The writer himself or herself. But I have news for you, because all those writers of the biblical studies, they are all dead. And so I hope that you see that it is not surprising now that in biblical studies, many people start wondering if the methods that we have used until now are really effective. And if instead of favoring the author or the intention of the author, we should perhaps look at the two other factors of the text, the reader and the text itself. Now, those are the limits that I indicated. But, and I would say now, please don't misunderstand what I try to say here tonight, because I really believe that it would be disastrous to give up totally the work that we have been doing. Even if we cannot discover the precise author and his or her intention, the search for the world behind the text has to go on. Why? Because those texts come indeed from a world which is so different from our world. And so this work that has been going on now in this century has to continue. And most of the work, at least for the ordinary Bible reading, is done in a certain sense for you by translators. Translators try to do that. Translators try to bring that old book from one culture into a new culture, into our own language. But even with the best translations that we will have, and even with all the work, and all the richness that we will discover, we will know and we will have to admit that we are always with the unanswered question. And that all the answers that we will find are always tentative and incomplete.
Thank you, Dr. Vogels. And Dr. Vogels kindly accepted to field a few spontaneous questions you would like to address to him. So here is a golden chance to clarify whatever you would like to be clarified. I will take the privilege of the chair to ask you, when you were addressing chapter 3, verse 15, Walter, you mentioned who, it, he, and you never mentioned she. Is the she excluded from the
Yes.
Hebrew text,
Yes,
actually?
yes. In Hebrew, they have he for she. Like in French, you have il et elle. So, il can be translated in he or it, but you never can translate he in elle. Il in she. You got that?
I'm working on it. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, maybe. There is that, especially in the Catholic tradition, that, the statue of the Virgin. I will, I come back to that tomorrow in one of the lectures, because I pointed to that this is, this is a difficulty of the language. So do you see that according to the reader may choose to opt for something. Why does that reader opt for that? Why does that reader opt for a different translation? So it is no longer the text, it's not the intention of the writer, it is the reader.
Surprising to see Jerome favoring a big translation, but we'll hear more tomorrow. You have something else?
Yeah, I was happy at the end when you mentioned the fact that it would be disastrous to give up the historical critical method, and yet you have shown us the complexity of that methodology. What's your
moment, please. Can you hear in the back what Gerald is? Would you stand by the mic, Gerald, maybe in the middle, so everybody hears your words of wisdom?
You have shown us the complexity of that methodology, and yet at the end, you said clearly that it would be disastrous to give it up. My question is, what's your sense as to whether we should continue in, let's say, in faculties such as this one, or in faculties like ours at the Atlantic School of Theology? What's your sense as to whether we should continue making a point to introduce our students to that methodology?
Okay.
Okay?
Okay. No, this is a very important question, I think, and I'm glad you raised the question. Of course, in a certain sense, my answer is going to anticipate on the things that I'm going to say tomorrow on the two other aspects, but since you raised the question, I have a feeling, maybe I'm wrong, when I speak about interpretation in the second millennium there, I have a feeling that not too much new is going to come from the historical approaches. I may be wrong, because there can always be surprises. But I think all of us, we work in biblical studies, that we see that we are turning in circles. We really feel that we have reached somehow, somewhere, a dead end. Not that we say that we were wrong, but that we say we can go only that far. Okay? I hope that I have showed that a little bit. Now, from there now say this is wrong, that would be totally, like I said, would be disaster. Because then, and of course the dangers of the other methods, I will indicate them tomorrow, but I think you can suspect what the dangers would be of a method that would not integrate into the approach of the Bible the historical context. That would be a disaster. But what I intend to say is that when I'm looking for where is biblical studies going, what can we expect in the future, I think that the future lies in new approaches more than in those, because those have done a tremendous job, but at the same time I think we came to somehow a dead end. Now, to answer your question more precisely, I can only answer for my own experience, but I think that this would be, I would use the same word, disastrous or totally unjust, if I would introduce my students, and I speak now of undergraduate students, I don't speak of master students, I don't speak of PhD students, but I speak of people who start biblical studies. If you would not introduce those people to the tremendous results of historical approaches, because we have to know that those texts did not fall out of the sky, and that those texts have a complex prehistory. But what I do, this is personal, I think when I started teaching, I thought that a lot of things were extremely important. But now I think that some of those things are not really that relevant. I don't know if I have answered your question.
You're reminding me of a few years ago in the seminary, one of your countrymen, Leo Woodian's taught us scripture in much the same way as you're teaching tonight. And I remember having a conversation with him about the importance of study and scholarship. And his advice to me was, read the Jerome Biblical Commentary, chew it, understand it, read it through and through, and then throw it away. And it seemed that there was a process that was entered into through the critical historical method in studying, but that there was always more, and that the more was dependent upon somehow internalizing what you're presenting.
I wouldn't go as far as to say throw it away. No, but I understand what that. No, I understand what you say. No, but simply, but you have a point there, you know, and to come back, that connects a little bit with the question what was asked there. I think that as students in theology or students in biblical studies or in religious sciences or whatever, that we have to know those things. And this done, once we have understood that, this is going to prevent us from really saying stupid things about the Bible. This is going, even if you forget so many of the details, but this is going to prevent us to say real stupid things about the Bible. I think the lady had a question.
You've told us that we are still looking for the writer.
Yes.
And you've told us that even if we know who the writer is, we still have to consider the conditions under which he or she was interpreting the Bible, whether she or he was conscious or unconscious. All those influence the person who wrote, who interpreted the Bible. We have also got to look at the environment and the cultural influence. So, taking all that into consideration, would you agree with me then that there is not going to be a day when we are going to have one unanimous interpretation of the Bible, be it in the 30th century, 99th century? We are not going to have a unanimous interpretation of the Bible, because right now the feminists are busy having their own interpretation of the Bible. The youth are also going to do whatever. All the various groups are going to interpret the Bible according to their time, according to their culture, according to their century. So are you agreeing with me then that until Jesus comes again, we are not going to have one way of interpreting the Bible?
Come to my lecture tomorrow morning. Do you see what you have been saying, that you start from what perspective? From the reader. You say feminist. Do you see that you speak not about the author, you speak about the reader? No, but I mean that example that you have given. So this is precisely what I'm going to talk about tomorrow a little bit. But to pick up on what you said, and I hope, by your question perhaps it became clearer. Do you see that even if I don't know that you wrote that particular text, okay? Do you see that if I read your text, that I can figure out probably that person who wrote that text, even if I don't know the name of the person, that I can see, that person must have lived in the Maritimes in the 20th century. Do you see what I'm saying? And so this is what I mean by the historical context. So even if I don't know the precise person, I know at least that. Now, if I would know on top of that you were the writer, and that I would know something about you as a person, that would enrich again the text. But even without knowing that, the fact that I can figure out through your writing that you come from the Maritimes in the 20th century, that you are a woman, and things like that, do you see that this is what I was referring to? So even if we cannot say, okay, it was that person who wrote it, we can figure out that that text was written in the 10th century, and even that's disputed, but anyhow. But for the rest, obviously, we will speak about that tomorrow, when you speak now about the reader, when you favor the reader.
Those who keep silent get content. Thank you very much, Dr. Vogel. You certainly have a great gift in making very simple what is very complex, actually, and I feel much more at home now already with the Bible. And that to read the Bible is to begin a dialogue between faith and faith, between the believers of the past and the believers of today. Not only do we read the Bible, but also the Bible reads us. In conclusion, I would remind you that the lectures continue in the same auditorium C tomorrow at 10 o'clock, when Dr. Vogels will address the topic, The Reader Gives the Meaning, and at 2 o'clock, when he will speak on The Text is the Judge. Now, I would like to invite all of you who would like to meet Dr. Vogels to join us in room 405 for refreshments. On this floor, here down below, on your left and right, wherever you turn, it's a circular building. You will hit room 405. Thank you.